So, I'm really happy to have Doug Green, the author of, among other things, Communist Insurgent, biography of Blanqui, a great figure of 19th century French communism, to give us a lesson on dialectical materialism. Take it away.
Thank you, Sam, for inviting me. Thank you to Socialist Action SA for inviting me as well. And just a few caveats before we begin. I do have copies of my book on sale, which I'd like you to buy. Those of you, I guess, who are watching this, you can buy that online, and please buy it. I am not speaking on behalf of Socialist Action, actually, I'm not speaking. This may not necessarily represent the all the views. So if you're in a party branch meeting, it's like, why did he quote that guy? He's not good. Well, so just so that's clear. I'm happy to take questions afterwards, I guess, also about any research I've done as well. And hopefully this will only be about half an hour. And it's going to be divided into three parts. Part one dealing with dialectical materialism, part two on historical materialism, and the third part trying to relate them to practice. So I guess we'll get started. And I'll start with a quote from Trotsky's The Lessons of October, where he says, "What is the Bolshevization of the Communist parties? It is giving them such a training and effecting such a selection of the leading staff as would prevent them from drifting when the hour of their October strikes. That is the whole of Hegel and the wisdom of books and the meaning of all philosophy," end quote. And I think Trotsky's words cut straight to the point on the importance of Marxist philosophy. A revolutionary politics requires a revolutionary philosophy. Marxism is not an academic exercise to produce obstructionist texts analyzing the subtleties of the Grundrisse. And there is no greater insult to the working class than to claim that philosophy and theory is beyond their understanding. And I should add, if you take away nothing else from this, it is this lesson, that it is not beyond anyone here to learn it. It is not the special purview of intellectuals. It is not the special property of academics. It belongs to everybody. Everyone is capable of learning and using it, without exception. That philosophy is, Marxist theory is not something that gets in the way of practical work and getting things done. Rather, Marxist theory informs our revolutionary work as an antidote to opportunistic shortcuts. It is only by knowing the world that we can change it. At the heart of Marxist philosophy is the dialectic. Few terms are more used and abused in the annals of Marxism than this one. At its best, dialectics has offered Marxists a creative method to accommodate complexity, motion, and change in their categories. However, all too often, dialectics has been reduced to a dogma or an empty platitude that can be used to justify anything and everything. Before proceeding, it is necessary to give a brief definition of the dialectic. And according to Engels, dialectics comprehends things and their representations, ideas in their essential connection, motion, origin, and ending. The dialectic is a critical revolutionary method that comprehends the general structure of reality, which is itself dialectically structured. The dialectical method involves three major principles: totality, change, and contradiction. And I want to elaborate on those terms. Well, totality is looking at things not in isolation, but viewing all phenomena as interconnected. Totality is not something unique to Marxism. There are non-dialectical forms of totality, such as bourgeois sociology or religion, and they do. But how does a Marxist conception of totality differ from these? George Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist, defines a dialectic form of totality as follows, and I quote, "The true materialistic dialectical totality, in contrast, is the concrete unity of struggling contradiction. This means, first, that without causality, there is no living totality. Second, that every totality is relative in both directions. that is constituted out of subordinated totalities and entering as an element of a subordinating totality. It follows, therefore, that the function mentioned earlier is subjected to a similar subordination. Third, that every totality is historically relative as well. It is changeable. It can come apart and exist as a totality only under determinate, concrete historical circumstances. In other words, a Marxist totality does not view the different parts in isolation, but is linked to each other in a complex, shifting, and dynamic set of relationships. Once a part is included in the whole, then it takes on a new meaning. For example, economics cannot be viewed apart from other factors. We are also concerned with the history of economics, such as how a particular economic formation is born, grows, and dies. Economics is also linked to politics. While Marxists see economics as part of the greater whole, the bourgeoisie considers economics, history, and politics as separate spheres of knowledge. A bourgeois standpoint is by definition fragmentary and partial. Instead of viewing the totality of the real social relationship, they see only bits and pieces in isolation. It is only a Marxist viewpoint that sees different spheres of knowledge as part of a greater totality, and this enables the proletariat to understand the whole as a whole. This brings us to the second dialectical principle of change. The bourgeoisie does recognize that the world undergoes change. In fact, bourgeois history acknowledges there were other forms of social organization before capitalism, such as slavery and feudalism. After the advent of capitalism, though, bourgeois historians believe that history is ended. Capitalism is seen as a self-regulating, efficient, and harmonious system. To the ideologues of the bourgeoisie, no other social organization is either possible or desirable. Well, capitalism does have periodic crises. This is not an argument against capitalism for the bourgeoisie. Their premise is that capitalism is basically a sound social system, means nothing is inherently wrong with it, but that change comes from the outside, whether from natural disasters or the result of flawed human nature. Marxists view change differently. For us, the main source of change is not external to a phenomena, but is internal to it. And change includes both gradualness and rapidness. These two forms of change should not be viewed as separate, but linked. Take the example of an earthquake that comes out of the blue. While an earthquake may appear suddenly, it is the result of the gradual buildup of natural forces. To give another example, for bourgeois onlookers, revolutions appear to be inexplicable madness. But Marxists know that they are the result of all sorts of social processes that socially accumulate before exploding, erupting. Both earthquakes and revolutions are examples of one law of change, which is the transformation of quantity into quality. This form of change is where quantitative change results in qualitative change. The second law of change is the unity and interpenetration of opposites. The unity of opposites is simply a way of describing contradiction. One example of a unity of opposites is between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the struggle between those who own and those who don't. This is the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, and we'll discuss this a little bit later. The third law of change is the negation of the negation. To put very simply, the negation of the negation claims that the struggle of opposites means that one, say the proletariat, negates the other, the bourgeoisie, and is in turn negated. The proletariat, by abolishing the bourgeoisie as a class, also abolishes itself as a class, leading to something new, in our case, communism. One way of popularly describing this law is using the dialectical triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. However, the triad is a vulgarization of both Hegelian and Marxist dialectics. The negation of the negation is better represented as a German word, Aufhebung, probably didn't say that right, which means multiple things: sublimation, to abolish, to transcend, to supersede, to preserve, to pick up, to end, to keep, to raise, and to annul. Essentially, it means all of them. This is actually a very controversial law among Marxists, broadly speaking, with some seeing the negation of the negation as a form of Hegelianism and fatalism, where the resulting synthesis expresses the resolution of conflict in a semantic way that implies synthesis as fusion, merger, even the emergence of harmony. At one point, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong said that the negation of negation is not a dialectical law, it should be banned. The negation of negation is not so much a merger or harmony, but the emergence of something new. According to Lenin, the negation of the negation is not simple evolution, but he says it's far more comprehensive and far richer in content, and proceeds in spirals, not a straight line, a development by leaks, catastrophes, and revolutions, breaks in continuity, the transformation of quantity into quality, impulses toward development, imparted by the contradiction and conflict of the various forces and tendencies acting on a given body, or within a given phenomenon, or within a given society. The interdependence and the closest and insoluble connection between all aspects of any phenomenon, whether history revealing ever new aspects. A connection that provides a uniform and universal process of motion, one that follows definite laws. These are some of the essential features of dialectics as a doctrine of development that is richer than the conventional one. And that is from Lenin's work in volume 21 of Karl Marx, of his collected work. In other words, the negation of the negation is not an inevitable process, but one of profound twists, leaps, upheavals, where something new appears. This brings us back to the final law of a dialectical approach, contradiction. Lenin said that contradiction was the most basic law of dialectics. The splitting of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics, he said. Contradiction is universal to all phenomena and things, where change comes through the development of an internal contradiction. According to Lenin, contradiction alone furnishes the key to the leaps, to the breaks in continuity, to the transformation into the opposite, to the destruction of the old and the emergence of the new. For Marx, this contradiction is the form of change that explains how one type of class society succeeds another. In the case of capitalism, we have the contradiction again between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The contradiction of capitalism prepared the ground for socialism. This transformation does result from gradual it does not result from gradual evolution, but is a conscious revolutionary act by the workers. However, a few caveats must be added to our discussion. Well, contradiction is universal to everything, but the particular manifestation of a contradiction will look different than any abstract law. Saying the contradiction between the workers and the bourgeoisie leads to socialism does not mean we are always and everywhere confronted with two singular classes fighting in battle. Far from it. The particular characteristics of this contradiction look different depending on the context. France in 1871, Russia in 1917, or the United States today all look different. It is still imperative for Marxists to undertake a concrete investigation of a concrete situation. A second caveat is that reading a few texts of dialectics does not provide anyone with ready-made answers to other sciences such as biology, the origin of the universe such as the Big Bang, chemistry, military theory. Please, for the love of God, don't do that. As Trotsky said, the dialectic does not liberate the investigator from painstaking study of the facts. Quite the contrary, it requires it. But in return, it gives investigative thought elasticity, helps it cope with ossified prejudices, arms it with invaluable analogies, and educates it in a spirit of daring, rooted in circumspection. Materialistic dialectics must not be viewed as a single mother of science that provides easy answers to all questions. This is a dogmatic interpretation of Marxism that should be rejected. Don't do the Lysenkoism shit. It's terrible. A third caveat is that a dialectical approach is incompatible with reductionism, since the parts and the whole are not reducible to the other. To return to an earlier example, it is not the case that economics mechanically determines culture, ideology, politics, etc. There are complex mediations, interconnections involved. Attempting to reduce a totality to a single element, whether it is objective conditions or bad line, or means ignoring the other parts of the totality and how they interact. To offer a very brief and compressed and perhaps violent definition, the general form of the Marxist dialectic is an internally contradictory totality in a constant process of change. And now we're on to historical materialism. The application of the philosophy of materialist dialectics to society is historical materialism. In order for Marxism to function as a science of society, It must be a form of materialism, acknowledging matter's existence independent of thought. Or to say the same thing differently, it is social being that determines consciousness. This means that the first premise of the materialist conception of history is not with people's consciousness, but with living people who are engaged socially in production to satisfy their basic needs. As Marx and Engels said, thus the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. As opposed to animals, people produce and reproduce their own means of subsistence and thereby play an active role in creating their own material existence. Before people can create art, literature, or practice politics, they must be able to sustain themselves. And life, Marx and Engels say, involves, before everything else, eating, drinking, habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is an historical fact, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely to sustain human life. End quote. It may be asked how people sustaining themselves makes them different from animals. After all, lions hunt for food. The fundamental difference is that human labor consciously acts upon nature in order to make it suitable for their own needs, while animals largely act on instinct. People can use their minds and their hands to conceive buildings, literature, computers, and airplanes, etc. These creations are consciously imagined before they are physically created. Through our labor, human beings can reshape the tools provided by nature to our own purposes. It is through human labor that civilization has emerged with art, culture, etc. According to Marx, what is constant to the labor process, no matter the mode of production, are the following three. 1, the purposeful activity, that is work itself. 2, the object on which work is performed. And 3, the instruments of that work. End quote. On the whole, human labor is not organized individually, but socially through various modes of production that extract surplus labor and ensure the reproduction of society. Human labor enables for people to increase their productive capacity, create a surplus beyond their immediate needs. According to Marx and Engels, each stage contains a material result, a sum of productive forces, a historically created relation to nature and of individuals to one another, which is handed down to each generation by its predecessor. A mass of productive forces, which on the one hand is modified by the new generation, but on the other also prescribes for it its conditions of life, and gives it a definite development of special character. It shows that circumstances make men just as much as men make circumstances. And in the course of human evolution, a minority of the population gained control of that surplus, dividing society between those who had control of the surplus and those who produced it. This gave rise to class relations. Again, for Marx and Engels, the production which these productive forces could provide was insufficient for the whole of society and made development possible only if some persons satisfied their needs at the expense of others, and therefore some, the minority, attained a monopoly of development, while others, the majority, owing to the constant struggle to satisfy their most essential needs, were for the time being excluded from any development. Human history is driven forward by the central conflict between the direct producers and those exploiting them. Or as Marx and Engels put it, in a passage I hope you all know very well, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Since historical materialism recognizes that society is constantly changing, it understands that there have been different classes and different modes of production throughout history. Marx identified different modes that have existed throughout history, such as primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and hopefully socialism soon. Since historical materialism is a dialectical theory, it recognizes that each mode of production is historical and transient, meaning that the level of productive forces develops over time, and they conflict with the existing social and political relations of production developed at an earlier time. This antagonism between the forces of production and the old relations of production is at the same time the struggle between classes, is the driving force of social revolutions that Marx describes in a classic summation of historical materialism found in the preface to a contribution of a critique of political economy from 1859. In the social production of their existence, men invariably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in their development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the proper relations within the framework of which they have hitherto operated. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. End quote. It is necessary to add some important qualifiers on Marx's analogy between the base and the superstructure. To put it simply, the base is the economy, and the superstructure is politics, state, ideology, etc. that is built on top of it. This metaphor has often been misinterpreted by anti-Marxists and very many Marxists to mean that the base automatically determines the superstructure and that social change will inevitably result from the working out of natural economic laws. The history of capitalism has shown that while crisis and breakdown is inherent to the system, but that while that is true, that it is inherent, it simply opens up the possibility for revolutionary transformation. In fact, we need to take into account other factors aside from economics, such as politics and ideology. And while economics is certainly decisive in the last instance, Engels once said, there's a certain degree of relative autonomy that exists between base and superstructure. What role does ideology play? For instance, at its most basic level, ideology is necessary for the bourgeoisie to rule. As Marx and Engels say, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force society, is at the same time the ruling intellectual force, end quote. Naturally, the reigning ideology propagated by our rulers through art, culture, etc., supports the existing relations of domination and exploitation. This does not mean that ideology is simply a form of false consciousness where workers are manipulated and fooled by the ruling class, although that does exist. According to Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, bourgeois hegemony is ultimately based on force, that's true, but they do not rely solely upon it. For the bourgeoisie to maintain its hegemony or rule, it cannot always use the stick, but has to use the carrot as well. And he says, the normal exercise of hegemony on the now classical terrain of parliamentary regime is characterized by the combination of force and consent, which balance each other with reciprocity without force predominating excessively over consent. Gramsci says the bourgeoisie transmit their ideology and culture through the various organs of civil society. By civil society, Gramsci refers to the ensemble of organisms that are normally called private, which is like political parties, trade unions, the media, churches, schools, etc. These organs of civil society are the vehicles through which the capitalist class fosters consent due to the spontaneous consent given by the great mass of the population to the general direction imposed on social life by the dominant fundamental group, the ruling class. This consent is historically caused by the prestige which the dominant group enjoys because of its position and function in the role of production, end quote. In other words, the bourgeoisie, since it controls the state and the means of production, is able to disseminate its ideas and ideology throughout society. This being the case, we should not be surprised that bourgeois ideas are so widely believed by the working class and become common sense. Common sense is not a single coherent or rational worldview, but contains scattered fragments and half-truths from liberal, conservative, socialist, and other sources that are absorbed in all sorts of contradictory ways by people. Gramsci defines common sense as a conception which even in the brain of one individual is fragmentary, incoherent, and inconsequential in conformity with the social and cultural position of those masses whose philosophy it is, end quote. For example, a person may accept all kinds of myths as natural, such as Donald Trump's idea of make America great again, but support unions or whatever, and believe all people are equal before the law and oppose foreign intervention. They could support all of those at the same time. That's just the way ideology is. Now let's move on to the last part, from theory to practice. The main criteria for proving the truth of Marxist ideas is practice. Our knowledge of the world does not simply arise by chance or merely in quiet contemplation, but through active participation in the material world. The source of our ideas and knowledge lies in social practice, testing and refining them in a continual process. In the end, it is only through practice that the problems facing humanity can be solved. How can the working class, which has been deprived of knowledge by the bourgeoisie, educate itself? Workers who accept their subordination and the reigning ideology cannot make a revolution. Then how can workers be educated for their world historical task? According to Marx, the materialist doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and it is essential to educate the educator himself. This doctrine must therefore divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human society, or self-changing, can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. Here's the answer to the objection that the working class is too backward and stupid to rule society on its own. The working class can only become fit to rule society by fighting to do so. Workers will transform themselves through struggle by changing both the existing conditions and themselves in the process. In other words, proletarian revolution comes not from benevolent savers handing down socialism, but through the self-emancipation of the working class. And there is, of course, no other path to socialism. However, this does not mean that revolutionary consciousness can emerge without mediation. Now, it is true that the daily experience of the worker of living under capitalism spawns spontaneous resistance among the working class. As Lenin observed, the working class in its daily struggle spontaneously gravitates towards socialism, since socialist theory reveals the causes of misery of the working class. But bourgeois ideology and common sense pulls them away from reaching those conclusions. Lukács observes that revolutionary class consciousness is not something that emerges spontaneously. Rather, spontaneous struggle runs into limits that can easily be reabsorbed into the system. And he says, it is certainly true that many spontaneous reactions to capitalism are rebellious in kind, and they frequently maintain their subjective oppositional or insurgent intent, even when they do not arise above the spontaneous level. Objectively, however, expressions such as these, by remaining spontaneous, generally flow into the system of tendencies that maintain the prevailing regime. Despite the limits of spontaneity, Gramsci warns that it is not to be neglected, even less despised. It is to be educated, directed, purged of its contaminations. The aim was to bring it into line with modern theory Marxism, but in a living and historically effective manner. The goal is to accelerate the historical process that is going on, rendering practice more homogeneous, more coherent, more efficient in all its elements, in other words, developing its potential to the maximum. Marxist theory needs to fuse with the working class movement through the mediation of the party in order for that to be effective. The party must learn from the experiences, scattered and unsystematic ideas of the working class by concentrating and synthesizing them. This method will enable the party to gain a relatively clear picture of objective reality. In order for the working class to truly be the makers of history, the party must be able to take their scattered ideas and concentrate and sum them up. This constant process of summation means the party can correct any mistakes or change their line based on new information. The party should be flexible, democratic, and centralized so its members can debate and test different ideas, strategies, and tactics. By contrast, a party based on bureaucratic centralism cannot correctly synthesize knowledge or implement the correct line. Without democratic centralism, there is no initiative or input from the membership, and the party leadership possesses a one-sided view of events and cannot be held accountable for bad policies. The point of the party gaining knowledge is to enable it to effectively advance the class struggle in a particular conjuncture. And what is a conjuncture? This is not just an academic buzzword. According to Gramsci, conjuncture is a set of immediate and ephemeral characteristics of the economic situation. Study of the conjuncture is thus closely linked to immediate politics, to tactics, agitation, while the situation relates to strategy and propaganda. A communist investigation of the conjuncture can include Lenin in 1917 is a really good example. Needs to take into account all the determinations, all the existing concrete circumstances, making an inventory, a detailed breakdown and comparison of elements. A conjunctural analysis is an inventory of the relations between classes, social contradictions, the role of the state, etc. According to Louis Althusser, a French Marxist, a conjunctural analysis poses the political problem and indicates its historical solution, ipso facto rendering it a political objective, a practical task. With this practical objective in mind, the various elements of a conjuncture become relations of force. They are assessed as relations of force as a function of their engagement with the view to the political objective to be obtained. The relations of force in a conjuncture are potential allies, enemies, or non-aligned who need to be won over, defeated or otherwise neutralized by the party. Since not all conjunctures are revolutionary, communists need to carefully investigate each one in order to determine the scope for action and the appropriate tactics and strategy to follow. Gramsci says that making a concrete analysis allows communists to conceive the different relations of force between parties and classes, which he says offers an opportunity for an elemental exposition of science and the art of politics, understood as a body of practical rules for research and of a detailed observation useful for awakening an interest in effective reality and for stimulating more vigorous political insight. If a communist party wants to conquer power, then this requires understanding not just the role of the class struggle and the inner laws of motion of capital, but also analyzing the contours of a specific conjuncture in order to develop the appropriate means, organizations, and strategies. A conjunctural analysis is where Marxist theory and practice come together to understand reality and develop the means for intervention. Through a party's analysis of a conjuncture, politics is transformed into strategy, and the class struggle can be organized, planned, and conducted with the conscious goal of taking state power. Now, to conclude, Trotsky is correct that Bolshevizing a communist party requires knowledge of dialectical and historical materialism. These invaluable tools will provide the working class with the ability to think, analyze the world, and develop the means to change it. Without taking up this revolutionary philosophy, the working class can never overthrow capitalism, but will forever remain at its mercy. Thank you.
Pardon? Okay, we're going to have a discussion. I encourage everybody to limit their remarks.